Hello, welcome to This Side of the Ceiling. I'm Kelsey.
And I'm Jill, and we're two good friends trying to live this life on this side of the ceiling as abundantly as Christ has called us to.
We are by no means experts, but we love to study His Word and share everything that He has revealed and taught us.
So come along with us as we open up the scriptures and dive into His wonderful Word. Welcome to This Side of the Ceiling, and you find us in a study of David, a man after God's own heart. And we are really exploring the idea that it's possible to have a heart like God. And we get to see a lot of David. David made lots of mistakes in his life, but yet he was a man after God's own heart. And last time we saw that David is a young boy and he is a shepherd out just minding his own business. We learned stories. He's protecting, we're going to hear that he is protecting them from a lion and a bear, and he's playing music out there, but he's just minding his own business, and God sees him and Samuel anoints him.
Right.
And God interrupts him and says, I have a plan for you. And after David in 1 Samuel chapter 16, after the Lord anoints him, then Saul is troubled and having a harmful spirit, it says, tormenting him. And so one of his servants comes up with the idea that they should find someone to come play some music. I even read that maybe it was like a worship music to soothe him. And one of his servants says, I'm going to read 16:18. Behold, I've seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who's skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence. The Lord is with him. And so they go get David, and he comes into Saul, the king's presence, as a musician.
Right.
And I just think it's so interesting that David is a young boy here. I mean, he's not old enough to go fight. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk next time about how his brothers are all off fighting the Philistines. He's too young. And so he's been given a job as a shepherd, and yet people know about him.
Right.
There's a servant that says, I know about this boy who's really skilled at playing an instrument. So I think that says a lot about David, that he, he's a musician, he's a shepherd, and he's very talented, just doing his own thing, and God interrupts him.
Right.
It kind of, I think of verses in the Bible where it says, he who's faithful in little will be faithful with much.
Right.
And so God is seeing David be faithful in these little things, and he has a plan for more. I think of the proverb that says even a child is known by his actions.
Right.
I don't know if David is a child, but he's young, and he's known by his actions. It kind of makes me think of, can you think of other people in the Bible that were just kind of doing their own thing, and God interrupts them? They're doing a good job, and God interrupts them and says, I've got something for you.
Yeah, I mean, the story of Esther, when she was interrupted and she becomes part of the royal court.
Yeah, she goes for such a time as this.
Right.
And God saw her.
And confronts to save her people.
Yeah.
Confronts the king to save her people.
Yeah. Of course, I guess Mary would be another woman.
Right.
A young teenager. And God really interrupts her world because it'll never be the same. I'm sure that she had people looking at her the rest of her life thinking.
Right. Yeah. And then Moses.
Yes.
And he's called, he sees the burning bush.
That's right. And Moses is interesting because Moses is also a shepherd. I mean, he did grow up in the palace, but, when he sees the burning bush, he has fled.
Right.
Married a woman, and he is being a shepherd just like David.
Right.
It's interesting how many people are shepherds in the Bible. I was trying to look, but Abraham was a shepherd. His sons were, we know Jacob, talks about how he kept all the sheep for when he was trying to win Rebecca and Rachel and Leah.
Yeah.
And And Amos, the prophet, was a famous shepherd. And then, of course, Jesus
Right.
calls himself
the good shepherd.
right. Yeah. So that's interesting that a lot of people that God used were shepherds. I think that might be worth exploring.
Yeah, and this week we decided to go to the most famous passage about a shepherd that David writes about, and it's Psalm 23. And we know that this psalm was not written when David was young. This was probably written toward the end of David's life, but it's one of the most famous psalms, and it talks about being a shepherd, and we are talking about shepherding, and so we wanted to go there today with Psalm 23. So I'll let you read that, and then we'll talk about it more a little bit.
Okay. So the Psalm 23, written by the shepherd David, but first thing he says is this: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever."
Yeah, so, in the first 3 verses of this psalm, David talks about, he is a shepherd, but he talks about God being his shepherd. So in this psalm, David's actually a sheep because the Lord is his shepherd. And so he is bowing down to his shepherd and realizing he's a sheep. He's not a shepherd. He is a sheep in God's presence. And he starts with, the shepherd leads him or guides him. So God is his leader. The shepherd gives him, he lacks nothing. The shepherd gives him all that he needs. So the shepherd is his owner, his leader, his owner. He makes me lie down, so he's his provider. He leads me beside quiet waters and his protector, and then restores his soul. He's a physician. So he acknowledges that everything he needs, God has provided for him as a shepherd. Mm-hmm. And David knows a shepherd very intimately because he's been a shepherd. And he knows what sheep are like. And he's comparing himself to a sheep. And you and I read a book called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23 by Philip Keller several years ago. But this book was written many years ago. In fact, it was published, I'm looking at the front of it, in 1970.
It's a good book, though.
Yeah,
it's a very good
really
book.
It's a really good book because this man was a shepherd. And so he talks about what sheep are like and what it's like to be a shepherd.
Yeah, because I think the people back in the Bible days would have known that more than we do today.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing I like about this scripture is that, there are some jobs or things that people do that we don't do today. But shepherding is still around. People are still shepherds. Sheep are still here, and people
sheep are still dumb.
And sheep are the same as they were back when David would have written this. And so I like some of these things that this book talked about sheep, but they cannot lie down, like it says, makes me lie down in green pastures, unless they refuse to lie down unless they are free from all fear. Free from friction with others, free from pests, so they can relax, and free from hunger. And so God has freed David because he's able to, God has made him lie down. So he has freed him from fear, friction, pests, and hunger. And so I think that's very beautiful picture of the way David pictures God. That, as a sheep, I can't lie down unless I'm free from this. And so God has given him a freedom. And then another thing we read about this is that sheep will not stop searching for water when they're thirsty. And so when it says, leads me beside still waters, in fact, sheep will stop at a mud puddle and drink the dirty water.
Yeah.
And so that's not the picture David gives here. It's leads me beside still waters, which is clean. You picture that as very clean. I'm not having to stop at this dirty water to fulfill my thirst. You are giving me the water that I need. And then restores his soul. Another thing that we read is that sheep cannot restore themselves when they fall. When they fall down, they get what's called cast, and they can't turn themselves back over. They need the shepherd to help them do that. And so, when David says, restores my soul, David knows that when he sins, he can't restore himself, that he needs God to restore him. And I love that picture too of David admitting, I can't restore myself, and it's only you that can restore me. And then guides me in paths of righteousness. David wanted to be led in righteousness. David admitted he couldn't find that path himself. He needed his shepherd to lead him into that path of righteousness. And then, in verse 4 of Psalm 23, David switches from talking about God to talking to God. And he says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. So in the beginning of this psalm, he's talking about the Lord is my shepherd. He makes me, he leads me, he restores me. But then he starts talking to God when he talks about walking through the valley of the shadow of death, which probably toward the end of his life, feeling like I am in that shadow of death. And he tells God, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And then notice what comforts him, the rod and the staff.
Yeah, those are, I think we kind of picture that as the same thing, like a stick. But really it was two different things. A rod had that little curve to it so that when the sheep fell over, like you were talking about, he had something to help them back up. So when they were cast on the ground, that he had something to help them up. He could rescue the sheep. And also, as you were mentioning, he leads me beside still water. The shepherd could stick the little staff off and kind of gently guide the sheep that were getting off. And also that the staff was something that the shepherds could lean on and rest on if they were outstanding watching these sheep. So the staff was something they could lean on, and it was a source of comfort, and then also of rescue. But the rod was more of a mechanism for protection that he could throw at an animal that was coming to attack. Or I also read somewhere that it was also a symbol kind of love, because in order to count the sheep, they would run them under the rod, and he would count them as they ran through the gate under the rod. There's even a reference to that, counting under the rod in the Old Testament in Leviticus. So those were two of the things that David would have carried with him.
And he sees this as comfort. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And so he definitely sees himself as a sheep. He's not going to fear the evil because God's with him, with his rod and his staff, and it's comforting. And then he says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Prepare a table. This is a picture of God preparing this table, specifically arranging it especially for David, knowing David personally, and he's going to set a place for him at the table. And in the presence of the enemy, the enemy doesn't have a place at the table, but the enemy watches as David sits at the table.
And David had some enemies. When David is writing this, he's probably picturing who's sitting at his table.
Right.
And David also was really good at letting God be the one to punish the enemies sometimes instead of him,
Right.
So this is maybe what he was waiting for instead of taking it
Right.
into his own hands.
Yeah. And then the next line.